We are live now, ma'am.
Wonderful, thank you. So a very warm welcome to all. My name is Dr. Esther Schmidt. I'm the director of the Center for Historic Houses of India. We really love this opportunity to collaborate with our friends and colleagues from across the world. So please really use the chat. And so we don't want to exclude the audience. We are very much about the audience, in fact. So, say from where you come from, comment and participate in what is hopefully going to be a very engaging discussion. This is the third Great Minds lecture, Great Minds in Heritage and Historic Houses, that we are doing this year. We had two standalone lectures earlier this year. One was the former head of the Aga Khan program at MIT and Harvard University. The other one is the colorman, the kind of probably best known colorman in the world, Patrick Beatty. So we love to have people who really who make a difference, who don't give up. And this is what I love so much about the heritage sector, because a lot of people would give up, if the house is about to fall down, but these people don't. They really have grit, and they're generally very friendly, I think. So I love my job. I love collaborating with other people. But normally we use it really as a panel discussion of people telling us a little bit more about their organization so that we can have a global debate. And I think this is very important because a lot of the heritage debate is still kind of Western dominant. So I'm kind of really happy to speak both as a kind of I'm a kind of blend between East and West. I was brought up in Europe, but I live in India. So I love to build bridges between the past and the present and East and West. Just a few words about the Center for Historic Houses. Perhaps you haven't heard of us. We are a very young institution. I founded it in 2019. We are not even 3 years old. And I think we've done a lot in the past 2.5 years. This year, we became a national expert heritage body. And just to tell you a little bit about this, with independence, there were 4 national expert heritage bodies, and they made a change and an amendment, and they added institutions, including us. So I'm extremely humbled, and especially that India is so generous to allow me as a foreigner to participate in the heritage sector. And a lot of you will know that kind of the people with the leadership function in heritage are still not foreigners usually. Yeah? So if we have, let's say, a leadership position in Austria, the person will be most likely Austrian. If you have a heritage organization in the UK, someone with a leadership position will be from that country. So that shows, I think, the very generous spirit in India and the very warm welcome that I actually received. We did a lot in these 2.5 years. We are very active in heritage education. You see, this is a beautiful review that has been written about this internship in the Oxford History Review. We have many applicants and interns from across the world, and of course from India, from many institutions such as Harvard, Cambridge, MIT, Columbia University, and so on. We've had Rhodes Scholars and Fulbright Scholars, which is really wonderful. And they have built the center. We wouldn't do what we have with what we have. And I think it accentuates this kind of young spirit of the institution that we have, because everything is really student-driven, volunteer-driven. And I'm really happy because now we are actually ranked number 2. We are considered one of the 10 global influencers for Palace Day, ranked number 2 after the Kremlin. And I'm sure President Putin has more support than me too. So I'm very proud of this because I didn't know anything about social media before kind of 2 years ago, but I used this opportunity during the pandemic and took everything online. We're very interested in the digital, connecting the historic houses with the digital. We are working with JP Chase. We are currently developing a few really exciting tools, including a dating app for historic houses. And I'm sure, John, you like that. This is kind of your thing, isn't it? So, which involves kind of more spontaneous relationships, such as pop-up shops, but also long-lasting relationships in the sense of a marriage, in the sense of buying a historic house, and bring these kind of people together. We have 2 very well-known lecture series. One is Brazilians, Historic Houses of India and Their Custodians, which is the first time, I think, that we were offering a forum to the former princes or maharajas who disappeared with independence. No one really knows what their role is. And we told and we let them speak and tell their history of the building of the family. And in most cases, this was the first time that this story was told in public in this format. And it has been a wonderful experience, a great learning experience. And the other one is, of course, the Great Minds. And you see the ambition that is behind it, because I want to address the very fundamental questions of our time, such as water and heritage. And sometimes I feel, when I listen to some of the other debates, there can be maybe a luxury debate in India. And I'm so glad that I can kind of combine my love for historic buildings with things that really matter, whether it's animal welfare or poverty alleviation. And this is some of the kind of relevance that is in the title of this talk, because there should be excitement and enthusiasm, and that we all have who work there. And I now want to talk a little bit about our speakers. And I'm very excited. I really think we brought together some of the most innovative and yes, wonderful people in this field. We can learn so much from each other and inspire each other. I'd like to start with John, because John, you also represent the National Trust, which is much loved. And I think you should really know this, how much the National Trust is loved. And I think everyone in the heritage sector is inspired by the National Trust to somehow, not only inspired, but influenced by the National Trust. This was the one institution that showed me that you can actually have a career in this field, because it didn't exist where I grew up in Germany. You like historic houses, you listen to some boring talks generally, and it's really amazing that we all kind of stick to it, because most of the talks were really horrible and, bombarded with names of who lived there and dates and so on. It's just so terrible. And so we all feel we want to change that. But I was a little bit kind of disappointed with the National Trust. It had a hard time in the past 2 years. And I felt some of the debates that I saw as an outsider now, being not in the UK, which is my second home, but being far away, very far away, not in kilometers, but also intellectually very far away. And I thought some of the debates were toxic on social media, that I saw how the two kind of, different views were kind of coming together. And I felt, while it is so important to talk about the complexity of history, and I always say the many layers of interpretation, in the moment we single one out, it becomes an ideology. I mentioned Germany, for example, where I come from. If you think of the DDR, and where they tried to kind of blow up aristocratic houses, or kind of left out this narrative and only talked about the artisans and the craftsmen, and it became an ideology, right? So how do we deal with this difficulty? And I always find you have to know so many things: architectural history, art history, biography, social history, economic history. I mean, and to bring this together in a kind of lively and engaging way. And so I felt that some of the debates were too negative currently. And I would like to talk about the National Trust and this kind of huge inspiration that it has always been for everyone in the field. And it is also the spawns in all of this. So don't ridicule these things, because they are so important, so much loved. So John, I'm very, very, very happy that you've taken the time to be here. Welcome to you. Now, Rima is also a wonderful person, and not only extremely knowledgeable, everything she's written about historic houses, particularly forts, and so many different aspects in art history, architectural history, but also always very open. Of course, she has 100 cats, which is, so nice, animal welfare. I feel very warm towards you, Rima, because of this. But I think you are someone so open to change, to making the best, to bringing a historic building to life, and not going this downtrodden path. And I think all of us who are there have this kind of mentality. Now, I wanted to mention Guy Torton, and with the pandemic, your institution actually gave the first online webinar talk. And I was there, and I thought it was amazing and mind-blowing, because I didn't have that kind of insight. And in India, we don't really have this kind of audience analysis. And I thought, we have to bring you here. We have to do this. And of course, Franklin, I'm so excited that you are here. Hi there, because I've used your book in my classes, and that was also totally new to the students, and that's not what they expected. And I think you have co-written one of the most important books in our field. that really rattle things, and we do want to rattle things, but you are really always trying to think about the audience, how to make it more exciting, how to bring them in, and this is so unselfish in a way, and I really love this about your work. So enough of this. I just want to show you this image. This is Jaipur Fort, and there is a debate: should we call it Jaipur Fort or just Jaipur? Because Ga means fort. And you have all of these difficulties in India, how to call the typology of buildings, right? So, but actually a lot of people now use Jaga as a name, and they don't use Ga as a typology. So I've seen this, even UNESCO is using this. So sorry, Rima, we can have a debate about this. I still call it Jaga Fort. And this is a property we are thinking about reviving and doing something exciting with it. And what you see is, to some extent, what you find in India in most places. It's an amazing property. I mean, you see the landscape is stunning, but if you count the people, not so many. And what do they do? Walking around and then leave. And I think this is where we need to stop or start here, that we don't only have kind of this passive behavior of listening and walking around and then leaving, but we want people to do something and to engage. And this in India is very different, because if you have someone who lives around the historic property, doesn't have electricity and so on, their priorities are different. But I still find we can include them by giving them learning opportunities and giving them possibilities to earn money, for example. And we have to talk about this, to earn money as well. There is the serious part of it. And then we have something like Maranga Fort, which has everything. It's a kind of prize-winning, award-winning museum shop. It has a visiting center. It has a museum cafe. And I know the English principle of a view, a brew, and a loo. It's so important. It doesn't yet exist everywhere in India. Having exciting exhibitions and having the global dialogue. So these are two contrasting things. And now I'd like to just take it over and give it to John, who comes from this most adored, loved institution, the National Trust, and tell me a little bit about this journey, you coming there, you bringing some change, and just bringing historic houses to the foreground, connecting them with the important topics that really matter, and making them very exciting for visitors.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. That's a huge topic, so I'm not quite sure where to start. But my background was in museums, the British Museum in particular, and I've been at the National Trust leading their work with historic houses and gardens and parklands, the context of the houses, for about 5 years now. Where should I start? Maybe I'll start just very briefly with the report that you mentioned and the debates. And a couple of years ago now, 18 months ago, the National Trust published a fairly simple analysis of the sort of colonial context for the historic houses that we care for. And it proved to be a litmus paper for a huge debate, and as you say, a rather toxic debate. I wonder why that was. I mean, first of all, it shows that the conversations we are trying to have were important ones, and actually that people care about the historic houses that we care about too. So actually, that's, although the debate was toxic and actually damaging for many of my colleagues, personally damaging, there is something important and something heartening in all of that. The thing about historic houses in the UK is that they represent something. They're more than the historic houses. And to some people, the role of the National Trust is to care for a notion of the historic house and what it represents to some people in this nation. And it took me a while to realise that, if I'm honest. So I think our role is of course to care wonderfully for the 200 historic houses in our care. But I think in a very different way from the way they've been cared for in the past. I think the National Trust is the successor to the previous owners of those houses, and that means that our job is not to hold them in one form, but to support them in evolving, in changing, and actually fundamentally to being more relevant to people, more what our visitors, what the nation wants them to be, which was your starting point in terms of sort of access and relevance. But what I discovered was that pushes up against another role, an apparent role, which is to hold on to this idea of to represent this idea that the historic house is a pinnacle of what it means to be, English, of what it means to be British in some way, and that's much more problematic and much more tricky. So, I mean, you know, I could talk forever, and I won't, because you'll want to bring in the other panelists. But I will just
in this context, namely the whole issue of relevance, and let's say Britishness, and you have someone who doesn't feel British or comes from abroad. And I think actually the highest number of visitors, aren't they German? You know, at the National Trust, a huge number. And I just wonder, you see, I love to go, let's say, to a Chinese art exhibition, and I'm not represented, but I still love it. So doesn't it also kind of foster tolerance? And, you know, or for instance, let's say someone who's very poor and comes to a palace in India and actually feels elevated and feels, oh, wow, this, you know, loves to know about this, you know, the Maharajas and so on. So maybe something to feel different is not necessarily a bad thing. And maybe I can ask someone now from the panel, like Frank, for example, who have, you know, been in charge of so many different types of buildings and so on. So how do you deal with the different audiences, the new audiences and their expectation, and them, you know, discovering something new, being rattled possibly?
Well, I think, at least in my experience and the research that Deborah and I did for the Anarchist Guide book, you know, everyone's coming to these historic sites for various reasons. And what gets them through the door is really just the first level of information. What you need to do is make sure that you provide varying degrees of information, both, for instance, you know, if they're coming because it's a really fancy house, it's a Gilded Age mansion, or that the owner was very notorious, you know, if that gets them there, then you accept that, you value that, and then you start to add information to it. I think one of the things in museums in the professional best practice is that we need to naturally focus the narratives down to one main narrative. And that's where this kind of mythology of a period of interpretation comes from, which I think, you know, I don't agree with. And in fact, I think that our visitors are far more aware and able to handle multiple narratives at one time. And in fact, I think scientific research is showing us that if you give visitors multiple layers of narratives with opposing opinions and views, they actually engage the site at a deeper level. So from my perspective, all of these things are just fantastic, have fantastic potential to really feed our visitors in ways that they may not even know about when they enter through the door. But that's just my take on it.
And this is really fascinating because, you know, the whole concept of interpretation, of course, it was born in the United States, you know, with the national parks movement and so on. It's really inspiring. And, you know, even the term historic house museum is a kind of Anglo-American term. It's not really used or understood so much, let's say, in Germany or India or France, because a palace wouldn't necessarily be referred to as a historic house museum. So there's always the question, is there a museum in the house? What makes the historic house, you know, a museum? Does it have to have a gallery space? I'd like to then talk to Rima about this and the kind of different audiences in India from what you know from your perspective, and then go to Guy, who really is the audience person per se and knows so much about this. So Rima, I'd really love to know from your experience now at City Palace in Jaigarh, who comes there, what is their expectation, what do they love about it, what brings them there?
Well, unfortunately for all of us, COVID has been this kind of dividing line between what used to be and what is. So since you mentioned Jaigarh, I'm also the fort keeper of Jaigarh. I happen to be the director there also. And at this point, it is almost, it's mostly domestic tourists. It is local people. And it is a small number of say, diplomats trying to get away from routine work who come there. But over the last so many years, it has always been more international visitors coming. So there was a point where the City Palace Jaipur Now, the City Palace, Jaipur, is a 295-year-old building, which by Indian standards might be young, but that's how old the city of Jaipur is. And the city of Jaipur, the old walled part, has been inscribed as a World Heritage Site. So people automatically want to see the World Heritage Site, but they were coming to Jaipur for shopping and sightseeing and all the historic architecture anyway. The museum and the City Palace kind of became an additional thing for them. It always was. And from a time where we were having between 5,000 to 10,000 visitors a day during not the peak season, but not the off season either. We've had a time where we had, 67 people coming in and long periods of being shut. So what is the norm anymore is difficult to tell. But what are people looking for is that too changes. And at this point, I think people are coming partly to see our collection, which is not, it's a spectacular collection, but it may not be displayed in, and if you're wanting to tell a particular narrative, we still have a lot to do there for some galleries, not for the others. But they also want to see our buildings. So, as I said, it's a palace. So the outside, the facade, is as beautiful as the inside. And one of the attractions is that they can wander around that building. Now, one of the early points you were talking about was what can be done with forts and other places. And for me, the question there is, who is going to be deciding about historic buildings? So if they are under, say, the National Trust, or if they are under one of the Government of India wings, or if they are under a private museum, who decides? Does the public decide? Do the trustees decide? Does the director decide to an extent? I'm going to leave it there because I think we can open up a lot more going from there. But definitely people coming to us want to see the collection, but they also want to see where did the Maharaja live. Oh, you mean the Maharaja still lives here? Actually, he does. So we are a place where there is the former ruling family of Jaipur lives there. That English thing about a man's home and his castle. In this case, a man's palace is his home. So they want to see that, and a part of it is open to the public. But we have also got sections of the museum where a lot of public celebrations take place. The museum profession. Yeah.
You may say something, and then I think Frank wanted to say something. The Jaipur case is really interesting because we have a relatively modern 18th century palace where you have particular, and we are creating a palace museum network because we want to see what is the commonality. I'm looking, for instance, at room typologies. No one has written about room typologies, for example, because the elements of the palace are dependent on how they were used, let's say treasury and, chini khana or whatever, certain kind of, collections and rooms went hand in hand or related to the climate and so on. So the challenge, I think, is in India with the forts that are so spectacular. And you say that from the outside, it's mainly this, you are just in awe when you see that, but it's extremely challenging for any curator to do something with it because they're empty. So what do you actually do? And I think English Heritage, we should have someone from English Heritage. I said, what's the difference between English Heritage and National Trust? And someone said, if it's got a roof on, it's National Trust. So, what do you do with these kind of empty rooms without anything there? That's quite different from the English country house where you have a huge collection. So that is challenging. How do we deal with this? And then, I think, Frank, you wanted to say something. Then we really need to hear our audience specialist Guy on, because it's interesting in your case, because you have worked with so many different types of institutions across the world. And what has been your main insight in the past 2 years? And what is your advice, let's say, for India, if we wanted to start something like this audience analysis? And then my question to John, you have all of this available. I mean, you have so much amazing research, resources, and so on. But then again, to Rima's question, who decides what to do with it? And what are you going to do with this information?
Shall I let Frank get your point? And Frank, I think you wanted to say something. You go first, and then I'll take up.
It's fine. I just wanted to kind of make the point that, at least in the United States, we've got privately owned. I myself have run with museum colleagues privately owned nonprofits where you can establish your own narratives. You have a self-identity. And then I've also been a part of public-private organizations, which are owned, like in New York City, 23 historic houses in all 5 boroughs owned by the city of New York, but each house, each site, historic site, has its own friends group, which is a nonprofit which can raise money. So in Philadelphia, when I ran the Philadelphia Society for the Preservation of Landmarks, we had one house that had 6 degrees of ownership, from the municipality to the historic easement to the specific logistical contract. Each one of these requires a different kind of negotiation about the narrative, about the visitor experience. One thing that I found in consulting with Twisted Preservation internationally is that what may seem to be the appropriate answer from a distance, once you get there and you actually engage the organization and understand the politics, and I say it all the time, the political landscape, once you understand the political landscape, well, then those decisions start to probably take a different complexion. And I would imagine that all of that's been happening in the UK, a lot of that has a direct relationship on public funding versus narrative, all of that. So that's just what I wanted to add from my perspective.
Frank, I just have to conclude that because this is really fascinating. So what was your learning in a nutshell? What were the 3 things you took away as a response to these kind of different public, private, and so on, private, and how, as a recipe, so to say, how to deal with it,
right.
to successfully do the best thing?
I would say that my answer is that there isn't a recipe. One of my problems with the museum field is that we have so tried to professionalize it that we think that best practice is the answer for everything. And in fact, every organization that we've worked with needs its own professional best practice. It's so unique that it's difficult to kind of give a blanket statement or a blanket way of dealing with a particular issue. There's always staffing issues. There's always restoration issues. There's always curatorial issues. But when you start to place those in the political landscape, usually the answers are very unique. And so you spoke a little bit about that earlier with the difference between West and East and both probably politics, but also the way logistics operate with these sites. So in that way, I would say that it is so incredibly unique. I probably entered the field thinking that we were going to try to find the answer. And what I've come out on the other side is that there is no single answer. In fact, the answer needs to be found out from the nuances of the political landscape of that site.
And Rima, I think your first issue of who decides is still a puzzling question, will remain a puzzling question. I just remember a conversation I had with the director of the Prussian Palaces and Gardens, and a wonderful curator, a porcelain specialist, and he said, everyone only wants to hear about Frederick the Great. He doesn't want to speak about Frederick the Great only. So what do you do if the audience wants something and you don't want to? So for instance, or not exclusively, how do you deal with this? And now this is kind of the lead over to the audience man here. God.
Hi, good to see everyone. So for those who don't know my work here, we do a lot of audience research. So I guess I'm here as the advocate of the audience and have done for the last sort of 25 years. And we work with the National Trust and others as well, English Heritage, Chatsworth House, and lots of other, Leeds Castle, etc., St Paul's Cathedral. And so we're what we're really interested in is what motivates audiences, and that's sort of what's come up here. And I think you touched on what's sort of changed over the last 2 years in terms of motivations among audiences in response to COVID and directly connecting to historic houses. And one of the things that we've been noticing, which is really interesting, is how kind of basic motivations have reverted to in responding to COVID. As in, what I mean by that is we were obviously locked down, as it were, in our houses for months on end, not seeing relatives for months on end, years for some people. And so actually the opportunity to connect with others trumped a lot of other things. You know, it became the defining motivation, more so than, I guess, sort of intellectual connection with collections and houses. So sheer joy was kind of like became the most fundamental motivation. And I think this is interesting. Maybe, I don't know if this is unique to the UK, maybe more so, is obviously including National Trust houses, but many others, the house is just a tiny dot on the landscape of a huge estate, whereby the grounds, which are often a mix of parkland and formal gardens, are by far the biggest, you know, in terms of scale, elements of the site. But they're often the biggest motivation to visit as well. I think John would agree, which is one of the challenges that we've had traditionally in this country, and possibly even more so because of COVID, is people are connecting more and more with nature and the outdoors and being with others in nature. That the challenge is persuading people to go into the houses at all in some cases, and particularly persuading people to go back to historic houses. So you might have a membership of a historic site, heritage organization. You're using it as much as a sort of social space. And actually the challenge, I think, for a lot of our organizations is to find imaginative ways to reconnect people with the story of the house and the story of what comes with the house. Because, as I say, people are just wanting to be with other people in an outdoor space at times. And actually the houses, persuading people to cross that threshold again, I think is an interesting challenge of where we are now. And I think that's more so because of COVID. So yeah, when we think about motivation for audiences, we developed a model for motivation that we've used for several years, but we can't find a better version of it. So we keep reverting to it. We developed it with actually Tate Modern and the Tate galleries, but found it sort of applies to historic environments too, whereby we sort of categorize motivation into 4 things, which are either social, intellectual, emotional, or spiritual. And there's various ways in which we capture this. And as I say, I think for now, still a lot of people are at that kind of have reverted down to that social level in many ways. That's not a bad thing. It's just a different thing. It's a different way people are connecting with historic environments.
Fascinating. Of course, you mentioned also something which could be described as well-being, and this kind of, being, at peace and so on when things are not so peaceful.
Absolutely.
And I think this is important because, curators, managers of historic houses often take a, I think, overly intellectual approach. And, we like to talk about problems and so on, but maybe people don't want to hear problems and maybe they just want to feel good. And I think this is what I said earlier about the National Trust, I was so excited when I saw these green signs, the dark green, and then the National Trust, the oak leaves and so on. And I just, everything it embodies, and the cafe was there, and the shop with the beautiful soaps and things that we didn't have in Germany, where they were only, I don't know, a beer glass and a key ring or something, maximum in 1970s postcard. That has changed a lot now, especially in Prussian and Bavarian palaces. So what about this well-being? And I think the sense of awe and wonder that we need, and not always kind of problematized, like an avant-garde film festival, maybe sometimes just someone wants to see a romance or something, it wants to have escapism, and historic houses are tangible history in a way. And, like people want to, be like in a Jane Austen movie. I can't remember, there was a movie made about this and so on. So I think there is this kind of dream about these country houses, and suddenly, you sit different, you act different when you are in the house, and it's uplifting. And I think this uplifting quality, the spiritual quality of historic houses is important. Yes, John, how do you feel about this aspect and keeping the sense of childlike wonder about the historic houses?
I think childlike wonder is it's lovely. It's a lovely phrase. Actually, so what I'm interested in is the fact that these houses were once owned by a single family, or a few people, a single person. now they're owned by the nation. So what does that mean for them? That means I think that they need to change and respond to people's needs. And I'm very excited by Guy is absolutely right. The primary motivation for people visiting our places is social, and learning, education, and so on comes after that. It doesn't mean it's not important. But so what does that say to me immediately? Immediately it says to me that we need to start by thinking about what people need if they're going to have a social experience in a house. For a start, that means not presenting it in a linear fashion. Probably it means providing opportunities for conversation, opportunities for discussion and debate. It means providing opportunities for people to use houses, not just observe them. So why have a library that you can't read in? That's what a library's for. If you're the owner of this house now, come in and sit down and look at a historic book, understand something about it, but also pick up a book and read, or write something yourself. I just want to say one thing very quickly. Let me just mention the childlike wonder thing, and I'll tell you about something we're doing, which is going to be fun. It's also going to be slightly problematic for us, I think. We're developing one of our houses as a country house for children. So we look after 200 country houses for which the primary audience is adults, and we feel very comfortable with that. We present them often in a particular way. We tell arguably quite narrow histories about them, and we present them as though they are the real thing, when almost always, to be honest, they're not the real thing. They're a creative version. So we thought we'd do something a bit different. One of our houses has a museum of childhood attached to it. It's called Sudbury Hall. And so we thought, what an obvious thing to do, to think that just one of those 200 houses would be aimed first and foremost at children. So who decides how to present that? The answer is the children do. So we have a brilliant scheme of sort of children's ambassadors, and lots of children from local communities involved. They volunteer at the site, and they are making decisions about how to present it, and it will be probably noisy. It will be it will be shiny. It will be full of activities. It will also be beautifully cared for and conserved, but it will also be problematic for us. And I know I was in a conversation just last night with a specialist on historical houses who thinks what we're doing is deeply problematic there. And there may well, when we open it in September, there may well be some attention in the press and some criticism and all of those things. So it's an interesting world we live in. What we're doing there is entirely reversible. If we decide we want to make it a house and primarily for adults again, in 5 years' time, we can do that. But still, these are contested spaces. These are spaces where it's not quite as easy, it seems to me, as it should be to make changes, unless those changes are very much in line with the changes that curators have made over the last 50 years.
Oh, that sounds absolutely fascinating. In fact, Rima and we talked about this, and I'd like to talk more about it when I come to Jaipur next week. If I think of spaces like Jaga, I want to turn it into an adventure playground. Sorry, Rima, and the flying fox going down to the next spot. And sword fighting and so on. Actually, I'm bringing one of the interns as a national champion in fencing, so I brought her here on purpose. And create kitchen gardens and so on. And I've had some wonderful examples from Austria. So next time I should bring someone from Austria. They've been very, very creative in this way, especially Carnuntum, for instance, which was a Roman fort outside of Vienna, and they really have a chariot. I mean, what child hasn't dreamed of trying out to stand in a chariot? Isn't that amazing? And you can do that there, and you can make soap and try out Roman recipes and so on. So I think that's what, and you have a smithy there, right, at Jaga. So it would be so much fun. And children should really try to see how heavy a sword actually was. How could they even wield it? And trying these things out, and then making some own, making your own swords and so on. So I think children currently are really underrepresented in Indian historic houses. There are no really workshops. So you do a lot as well now.
Yes, I want to come in on that one. Yes. Because we've been doing a lot with children. We've been doing a lot with people with special needs also. And, tactile aids, access, all of those kind of things. But we actually had bunches of school children come in and help. They weren't really allowed to get that close to the swords. They got close enough, not enough to hurt themselves. But with that, you're actually standing on a rampart. Jagger was this Garrison Fort. So we've talked about Jaipur, and one of the forts that is ringing this modern city, this 18th century city, is a fort that goes back in time, but was redone in the 18th century. And so it was only meant to be a garrison fort. It wasn't a home for the royal family. But standing there, you still have the trees around you, and you can have, without too much imagination, you can actually have children do this, or young people say, how are you going to be guarding this stretch that you're looking after? You don't have your sword, but how are you going to get messages across? What are you going to, all of those kind of activities we've been doing. The other thing that sometimes restricts historic houses, of course, and palace museums, is that there is already so much material inside it that the visitor has to naturally, there's a queue manager, and you can't have everyone come in and touch everything. My own shout out of thanks to the National Trust, I did go into 2 priest holes, which was way back, way back when I was doing my PhD. But you cannot have everyone do it. Maybe in the children's home, the new place being done up, you could have something like this. But in most cases, we then have to create semi-artificial spaces about, how much please do touch you can have. Please do touch is all very well. But if it is a 15th century, 12th century, whatever, woven tapestry somewhere, you can't have people touch it. So again, how much access do you give the people? But how much of a say does the visitor have in deciding what we are doing? And should we be swayed only by them? I mean, that is, I liked the point that you were making about, who decides about the best practices part, and who does the best practice fit in? Is there a Frank? I'm sorry, I'm not sure which of you said it, but one of my co-panelists did say this. So coming back to it, what might suit one of the major palace museums of India will not be an identical experience somewhere else, because again, what are the other things we are dealing with? In this case, in the case of Jaipur, and I do want to use it as a case study, there is the equivalent of, it's not quite Friends of Museum as we understand it in the wider world. It is people who won awards in craft and art, and they have their own everyday lekden for free for visitors. And they occasionally also have workshops happening. And this is a link that goes back to when the royal family of Jaipur used to be patronizing a lot of the local crafts. Now, I just want to very quickly contrast this with the one of the other museums I'm associated with, and that is the Music Museum, which the Jaipur Virasat Foundation runs. You could call it a historic building because it's the 1950s, one of the sort of the 1950s buildings of India that is being torn down and giving way to high rises. So a small, almost a bungalow, it's now got one more floor, set in a larger space of land, where we've got a music museum, where the audience is different, and the audience can take a different trip using a lot more of technology than in the Palace Museum, where people expect you to have, your swords and shields and weapons and textiles, and of course the Maharaja walking through if they can manage that, but if not, lots of images of Maharajas. So again, I think we are in a state of flux. We are in a state where museums have been reinventing themselves, but what historic buildings and palace museums will be doing. Again, the Jaipur Museum is not quite like Beijing's Forbidden City, where it is that much larger. The Jaipur one is large enough to manage, but there is a point where you can exit and enter, and you can put away some of the stories. We still have more to deal with, I think, than we can at this point. I'm going to let someone else come in.
John,
Over to you again.
John, I agree. So much is down to our own professional approaches, and do we need to challenge them? This is why I think having such global discussions can be really helpful. And I wanted to bring in the topic of doing our share and connecting the historic houses with something that is really meaningful. So we talk about the audience that wants to have fun, maybe wants to have something peaceful, wants to have a spiritual experience, the whole gamut of human experiences. But using historic houses to address the fundamental questions of our times, such as, let's say, water scarcity in India, or poverty, for example. I feel this can be animal welfare. So many opportunities. I'd love to hear your opinions, and that's why I said some questions or some topics can be luxury debates, right? When you really have people who don't have enough to eat or don't have electricity. I think, especially in a hot climate, you really think about the bioclimatic aspect of architecture and how to make life more livable. And historic buildings also have a lot to teach us there, because very often they have a very nice climate. Actually, it's cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. I'd like to have your opinion. Yes, Rima.
I just want to say that yes, there is a lot of poverty, and we know that there is in many countries, but particularly when we talk about India. But the local community always wants to come in, and they do usually come in on concession tickets or also free, because that is an important part for us to feel that the people who live in the city, or even others, but that even if they're living in very poor areas. And one of the high points of one of these visits, I spoke to them during a COVID lockdown phase online. And I made this grand thing of, come and see our museum when you're able to. So they did. And they wandered around. And 5 of them at the end of it said, and these are, mind you, people who either have, Charles Dickens kind of family homes, that kind of thing. They said, I want to work in a museum when I'm older. And one of them said, what do you mean older? Another 2 years and I can get a job in a museum. But they do or not. They were interested enough in what was happening around them to want to do more than just live in that slum, surrounded by the people who are not able to kind of intellectually stimulate them. So this is one of the good ways in which the community engagement has been helping us.
Yes, and in this context, I should mention sometimes it's too much of the Maharaja also in the museum, right? Because you have one portrait, and again, it's this one figure after the other, and you just have dates. And I think this is so meaningless in a way. So I encouraged one museum, for instance, to maybe not talk so much about this, but maybe about what they liked. And one person liked food a lot. So I thought, why don't we turn this into a history of food? And then we can bring in the local community. We can have workshops about composting and so on, or they can have a farmer's market, for example, and then there's some employment opportunity. Sometimes the beauty is in India, you can spontaneously do such things. I think, in England, you have all sorts of health and safety regulations and so on. It might be really harder to do something like this. But maybe now, Frank, I'd like to hear your opinion about this kind of doing our share, connecting historic houses with the fundamental questions and really using historic houses to make lives better for people.
Yeah, I think that's really at the core of everything that I've tried to work with my colleagues on. I mean, for instance, at Old Salem in North Carolina at the beginning of COVID, our leadership team decided to transform all of our gardens into vegetable gardens. We have continued to produce vegetables for local food banks because we knew that COVID was going to start to increase food insecurity. All of our historic bakeries started to bake bread for local families in need. We're still doing that today, even as COVID lockdown has ceased. We're going to keep some of that as part of our normal basic procedure. I think what needs to happen with historic sites is that just this sort of idea, these two ideas, food banks and bread baking, that they need to be fully integrated and not the exception. We can still teach historic narratives while we grow vegetables for people in need. It doesn't have to be exclusionary. And I think that's really what my frustration has always been with historic sites. It's always been kind of presented as this polarity. that you have to show this fancy house and all of the great collections, and that's all you do, or it becomes some kind of less than history site where you're actually engaging the community. I mean, one of the houses that I ran in Philadelphia, Grumblethorpe, had a brick thrown through the window, and it was in a fairly, at the time, disadvantaged community. And what I realized was this community didn't need a historic house museum. It was in a very strong food desert. There were no grocery stores around. So this was back in 2006, I think. We transformed the gardens into vegetable gardens. We formed a farmer's market. We had area children actually write the business plan and operate the farm and run the farmer's market. And I'm happy to say that that farmer's market at Grumblethorpe, here we are, 2022, is alive and well because it served a community need. So when I hear these stories about talking how historic sites can engage communities, that's the level of engagement that I believe we all are, in some ways, at least I feel it, obligated to engage the communities surrounding us, because most of these sites are just normal people like all of us, and people who are food insecure. And, you know, this is part of our obligation as museum professionals. At least that's the way I think about it.
It's wonderful. I've seen fantastic initiatives like this, the Princess Foundation in the UK, but also in Germany and Italy, where the unemployed youth were actually integrated into the historic house, where they learned conservation techniques. They had startup projects, like started running a cafe and so on. Absolutely fantastic projects. Yes, really inspiring. Guy,
could I jump in on that? It's really, really amazing example. I think where the location is really important here, and I think what you've described there is your immediate community, Frank, which I think is you've directly responded to the needs of the immediate community. Just speaking from a UK perspective, again, thinking about where historic houses are is, as I mentioned earlier, often within a huge estate in the countryside. And therefore, actually, the audiences who can benefit most from it are furthest away. You know, those audiences who live in cities whereby there is more deprivation and different kinds, and those who have less access to things like connecting with the outdoors, who are less likely to do exercise, for example, they're the people who struggle to get to historic sites. And that there's two big barriers, aren't there, I think, to engaging with the historic houses. It's psychological, and I think in your comments you mentioned it as well, Frank, about this sort of perception of the rich, and it's where the rich are and the rich go, and rich have always been. But then there's also the physical, functional problem of getting people there. And so there's lots that still needs to be considered in that role of how we can, you know, broaden audiences in the context of the fact that these historic houses are always currently in these large country piles, if you like. Whereas I'm really interested in, and the Trust has been, I think, breaking ground here a lot, in kind of city centre historic houses in the UK. I think there's still a lot to be done on what we consider a historic house, redefining that. There's things like the back-to-backs in Birmingham, for example, isn't there, John? And even in my town of Manchester, Industrial Revolution being now considered as history and recent enough history to justify, you know, sort of reimagining, where we've got viaducts being taken over just as I'm driving past as a new historic site. And I think that's powerful in engaging people with history, and historic sites is one, historic houses is just one way of doing that. But yeah, a couple of challenges there for me.
John, what's your take on this?
Sorry, coming off mute. Oh gosh, there's so many things I could say. Let me introduce another thing, which is just the we have a role to ask questions, to get people thinking, to get people talking, don't we? So just to give you one example, at a historic site called Attingham, which gets about 500,000 visitors a year in the UK, we did an exhibition last year called a party, and we were it was Attingham was a party house, and we worked with a group of people who were apart. That's the name, a party. They were young people in care, who'd come through the care system, and it needed more support the most, and also young people who were carers themselves, sometimes who were caring for vulnerable parents, particularly going through COVID. And we got them to think, working with a number of different partners, including creative partners, about what home really means and what it means to be apart and what it means to be separated from people. And again, I mean, interestingly, it attracted, you wouldn't think these things would attract press attention, would you? But they do. And that's problematic, but it's also good because it got people talking and it got people thinking. And actually, the loveliest bit that I loved of that is that each child created a plate, working with an artist, and those plates have become part of the formal collection, the museum collection of Attingham House. So they are the new dinner service for Attingham. So it's just a tiny example, but I'm just trying to make the point that actually we have a role to get people thinking, discussing, and even some of the unhelpful focus that comes in the press can support that at times.
Interesting. Before we conclude, now we have 2 more minutes left. I would just like to know, well, John, you are part of an organization, but if you had a carte blanche and you could decide what is the one thing to make historic houses more exciting, and you didn't have to kind of arrange your opinion with anybody else, but you could do what you wanted, what is it that you would do?
That's such a naughty question, but I mean, I'm going to give you a bit of a bland answer, which is that I would do historic houses on the terms of our visitors, not on our own terms. It's an obvious thing to say, but it's fundamental.
Thank you. That wasn't a naughty answer. That was a very diplomatic and good answer. And yes, Rima, so you mentioned already about here. So what are your plans now for City Palace in Jaga, and in a nutshell, to make visits really exciting and to stop this kind of passive behavior of visitors just going?
Well, actually, we've never had passive behavior. Maybe because it is the nature of the collection which makes you react in a certain way. It's also to do with the fact that so many, I mean, this is one of the things which half the guides hate this and half the guides love it, because people want to know where was X film shot, whether it's a Hollywood or a Bollywood or a whatever. But no, they've never been, we've never had this problem of how to get more people. I think our problem is what are we going to be doing for the future? How can we cater for more people? We are catering to a broad range. I was looking at some of the comments as they were coming in. And the museum was made in 1959, by the way. So the private collection of the royal family was made into a trust. And therefore the trustees still call the shots. Whoever is a trustee calls the shot. But having started that way, they've given a lot of time and attention to outreach, to having the local community part of it. And because Jaipur has a lot of crafts, we're also one of the UNESCO creative cities with, crafts in the plural. So they always do come in and interact. Students have been coming in. It is one of the places people come to. They're never passive. The problem is, how can we keep them more excited? How can we deal with the numbers? And of course, for people who really want to make more galleries happen, we've got more than enough material to put into galleries, but we need to be able to do it in a sensible way and not just put everything out there for everyone to see.
Thank you.
So the narrative that we are going to go in for, what is the narrative we will choose?
Right.
Thank you for having me here.
Before we come now to the end, I'd like to say we have another event tomorrow, which is specifically on non-visitor related business models for historic houses. A lot of people, private owners specifically, have asked me about this as a kind of wishful topic for them, especially because of COVID. How can you actually generate money? It's really interesting to see how creative some of the owners were. Like one lady, for instance, she did an online concert giving employment to a person who couldn't have employment, an artist. It was empty. She was live streaming it and connecting it with a pizza delivery service. Love this. Very entrepreneurial. Never went to business school, but this is so great. It's so cool. before we close, I would like to pay attention to our audience because we all care so much about the audience as well. And Lauren Winch has a question. She is one of the new Oxford interns who will be traveling to India just tomorrow. And Rima, you'll be meeting her. Her question is, hello, thank you everyone for the interesting discussion. I was wondering whether you could please talk a little about how historic buildings being integrated into a natural environment are responding to the challenges of the climate crisis, perhaps in terms of conservation, social justice, raising awareness, etc. So whoever would like to answer this.
Well, I can speak to the Newport Restoration Foundation. One of their big projects is keeping history above water. And in fact, a lot of the historic buildings on the coast in the United States, of course, are going to be very strongly prone to rising sea levels. And there are real solid preservationists who are looking at various ways to physically deal with historic structures and historic spaces and landscapes. So I think you're actually, at least in the United States, but I think it is internationally, that a lot of the historic spaces, because they were on the coast, are going to be prone to climate change issues. And so I think preservationists are really beginning to be deeply engaged in this as a subject.
And if I just may add, in England, of course, this is a very big topic. I remember Bob Woodside, right, from the English Heritage, is very active in this. Maybe, John, you can tell us a little bit about the National Trust, which is very active in this regard.
I mean, first of all, actually, just to admit that I think we have separated climate action is an absolute imperative for us as every organization. In fact, we only have two organizational cross-cutting objectives. One is around inclusion and diversity, and one is around climate action. It's fundamentally important for us. I think in the past, we have tended to see that as to do with our land and nature activities, and we care for a lot of landscapes. But that has changed significantly over the last couple of years. And so we're thinking about everything from, of course, from the adaptation of our houses, which is an incredibly complex thing, but incredibly important, to the energy needs of our houses, and how those are supported more sustainably, to communication and how we're working with people. Actually using historic houses as part of our communication to say, if you care about our historic houses, then you need to attend to climate action, because this is the impact that we're already seeing through increased rainfall or mold, or all of those things in our houses, flooding, etc. But also just a constant program of communication and education, which needs to come through every part of what the Trust is doing. So it's becoming absolutely embedded in everything that we do.
Thank you very much. So thanks everyone for being here. I really hope that you'll come and visit India, that we can work on some projects together in Rajasthan, Jaipur, and other places. Thank you so much. Please stay in touch. And yes, I'm looking forward to seeing you again in the future. Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you to the audience as well for being here. Bye.